Hey, good morning. I'm Lance French, Business Development Manager for Braun Intertech, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Highway to Help, Environmental Compliance for Transportation Projects. Our expert today is Jackie Dylla, our CHMM. Jackie, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me here, Lance. I appreciate it.
So before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please send them to me through your questions tab on your GoToWebinar window. If we don't get to your questions, I will make sure Jackie sees them and we'll get an answer to you as soon as possible. We are recording this webinar and it will be available to rewatch on our website soon along with the slides. And I'll send you an email with the link when they're made available. So let's get to it. So I want to give a quick, another housekeeping item that we normally don't. So Jackie is actually in Minnesota. And I guess they're having some weather. It's this white stuff. They're called sleet and snow. So there might be some technical difficulties, but if that does happen, we are going to re-record the webinar and send it to you with the link as well. So, Jackie, did I cover everything? I mean, there's probably some people.
You did, except I'm not ready for winter yet, so you didn't cover that. But yeah, well, I don't think any of us are.
None of us are, absolutely. So we were going to try to start this with some great AC/DC music, but we could not get it to play. So just imagine in your head AC/DC blaring out that right at the beginning, the highway to you know what, and it was going to be epic. So and now I am also glad that you didn't name this webinar "Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap" because that would be so Jackie,
stay tuned for that.
Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to you. Go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners.
Okay, well, as Lance said, my name is Jackie Dylla. I'm a Certified Hazardous Materials Manager, so that's the CHMM you see, or a CHUM, as some people say. I've worked in the business for about 21 years. I graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science. So some people ask me, are you a geologist? And actually, I'm a scientist. That's my technical term. A couple of the projects that I've worked on that, you'll see they're mostly Minnesota projects. As Lance mentioned, I'm in Minnesota. The key projects that I've worked on is, if you recall, the bridge collapse on 35W. That was a horrific incident, and I actually worked on the rebuilding project, which is kind of a project that's near and dear to my heart. In fact, whenever we drive that bridge these days, my kids even remember when I worked on this, and they call that bridge Mom's Bridge. So it's kind of a funny, anecdote, but it was a terrific project to work on. I've also worked on several other projects, including some transit projects like the Metro Green Line, which was referred to as the Central Corridor. It's the light rail between Minneapolis and St. Paul. The St. Croix Crossing Bridge, and I'll talk about that a little bit in this presentation. And then we're currently actually working on a project up in Duluth called the Twin Ports, or some people call it the Can of Worms because of the way that the highways kind of intersect. So those are some of the projects that I've worked on. Lance mentioned the weather, and I just thought I would just show you a picture of what my deck looked like on Tuesday as I was putting that presentation. I think it was like, goodness. It was like 80 degrees, Lance, when I think I was talking to you down there, wasn't it?
Yeah, so, it's hot. It's hot.
So for those of you who are in Minnesota, I think there's a common joke, and for those of you not in Minnesota, we have two seasons in Minnesota. We have winter and road construction. So I thought that was a pretty funny juxtaposition for this presentation, because, I don't really enjoy winter, but I actually really enjoy road construction. So, and most people don't like either, but just thought I would throw that out there. Our agenda for today's program, and feel free to ask questions in the chat box. Lance, you're watching that too throughout this presentation, right? And I think you're going to probably feel free to, Lance, to ask questions if you like.
My specialty.
We're just going to, it's your specialty, good. Not too hard ones, okay?
Yeah.
We're going to talk about just generally what's environmental compliance as it relates to transportation. Why is transportation so different? I'm going to provide a brief overview of the planning and design phases and what happens with environmental compliance during those phases, and then get into what's kind of near and dear to me is the construction phase and all of the associated environmental compliance related to that, like stormwater, erosion control, contaminated regulated materials and natural resources. And then I'll kind of summarize it up. I promised that I would provide some insight on how to avoid transportation potholes. So I'll probably provide just a quick summary of items to, consider when you're performing transportation projects with relation to environmental compliance. One other thought, just to kind of stick with the AC/DC theme, is there's a couple, I think there's 6 other references in this presentation to AC/DC. So feel free to shout out in the chat room when you see a AC/DC reference. I just thought that could hide those Easter eggs in there just to kind of keep people entertained, right? We've kind of been watching a lot of presentations and a lot of stuff on our computers lately. So I don't know, Lance, how was your AC/DC?
Hey, 80s rocks. I'm absolutely ready for this one. So
okay, awesome. I could imagine you with long hair doing some head banging, back then. But no,
I sport an 80s mullet. I'm not gonna lie. So.
Oh, a mullet. Okay. But even if you're not an AC/DC fan, just feel free to Google AC/DC songs in your computer and follow along with the game if you'd like. So we're going to go ahead and get started and just talk about environmental compliance. And one thing I wanted to let this group know, and I said this to Lance too, is environmental compliance is a huge topic. I think we could probably do a 3-day seminar on just environmental compliance and how it relates to transportation. So if you feel like I breezed over some things, I really did, but I want to just give you all a taste of all the magnitude of what needs to happen on a transportation project. And, there could be things like stormwater, wetlands. This is the storage of chemicals. We have to consider endangered and protected species, work in water, including floodplains work. Cultural resources, so archaeology, Indiana Jones type stuff, erosion, contaminated irregular materials, you see the asbestos sign right there, erosion control, you see that rut, that's a rill that's developing from some erosion issues, dust management and air quality, loud noises and vibrations are also part of the environmental compliance umbrella. Concrete management and concrete washout. If a spill happens, and believe me, spills happen a lot on construction projects, especially on transportation projects. And then just general housekeeping. These all fall under that environmental compliance umbrella on a transportation project. And I think one thing to note here is I've worked on a lot of transportation projects, and there's a lot of great people out there on the environmental side. But I haven't met one person yet that is the expert on every one of these items. And if somebody's saying that, they're probably not telling you the truth. And not to call anybody out, but what really happens on these projects is you might have one person who's overall in charge of environmental compliance. Sometimes we call them the environmental compliance manager. There's different terms I've seen. And that person's ultimately in charge, but really there's a team of people behind that are the subject matter experts for a lot of these items. So that's just one thing to keep in mind.
I just want to say that's a pretty scary location for that porta potty. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Yeah, you might fall in. The interesting thing about porta potties is they're actually considered a chemical storage. So technically on projects, you're supposed to have secondary containment around porta potties, and you're actually supposed to secure them so they don't tip over. Yeah. So that's one of the requirements that we have. So yeah, if
the ground is giving way around it, I'm not entering. I'll just tell you that right now. So
there you go. That's pretty smart. Yeah. That's pretty smart. So what's different about transportation? And, I've been working, like I said, in a while, and I hear people ask me, well, what makes transportation unique? And I think one of the major first things I think about is the scale of a transportation project, and not only the scale, the size of it, but the linear nature in a lot of ways. So the footprint of a transportation project, it's not uncommon because of, the scale and the linear nature that you're working with multiple local government units. I mean, I talked about, you have a bridge that spans from one state to another, or even one country to another, as well as, watershed authorities or counties or cities or whoever has some regulatory, input on your project. And that's what makes transportation so different is you can't just, think of one particular spot on the project that you need to comply with. You have to think of the project as the whole and all of the commitments for all of the local government units that you're working with. Another thing that's different about transportation is the different types of markets and types of work that you do. Rail is different than, heavy rail is different than transit, and certainly ports are different. Airports are different. I worked on a transit project and I got introduced to a whole new set of just acronyms and lingo, for the different types of construction features that a light rail transit project can have. And so that, just understanding the type of construction of the project and the market type is a huge factor when it comes to environmental compliance. Funding sources is another big deal. There's, different funding sources on transportation projects, and each of those funding sources have their own requirements. I can touch on kind of one of a specific example a little bit later. And then I think the one thing that people, I know there's a couple people on this call actually that they deal mostly with alternative delivery, but the contracting mechanisms is a huge factor with environmental compliance. And the reason why Lance is like, if you think of your typical design, then you bid, then you build the project, the owner is responsible for outlining almost every environmental regulation and compliance item that has to be followed in their specifications. It's on the owner's best interest to outline. So what they can get is they can get apples to apples bids. But then when you have an alternative delivery situation, some of that risk for environmental compliance is pushed over to the contractor side or the design build entity, and they are responsible for the environmental compliance. And I've just been on several projects where you've had a contracting entity that, I mean, there's so many components of bidding on a project, but they kind of gloss over the environmental compliance, and it kind of bites them, in the project, because all of a sudden there's, a requirement that they need to comply with something, but they didn't understand that during the bidding process. And the other thing about alternative delivery is the environmental compliance guidelines aren't as specific and outlined as in a typical design bid build process. They just provide kind of guardrails in the contract. And so really it's up to the contractor to really navigate between those guardrails and make sure that they're following the protocols. So there is quite a bit of risk that goes onto the contractor side in the alternative delivery. And so that really goes to show where you need to have your expertise, whether, it's on the owner side, on the contracting side, or both. But really, when you get an environmental expert on any one of these projects, it's good for that environmental expert to understand what kind of contracting mechanism they're working under. And so, I mean, this is just a quick graphic to show that that's any number of combination of projects that could happen. So really what's different about transportation and what's unique is a whole bunch of different things. And pretty much not one or two project is the same.
Yeah, I would imagine that, because it probably changes from, terminology might be different from like plat to plat. Like one plat, you might have more archaeology stuff. The other one, you might have more endangered species. And in another little bit further down the road, you might have some waters issues as well.
You're right. Yeah, you're right. So you kind of have to make sure you're looking at all of those items globally when you're bidding the project. But then you also need to make sure that you have, a team behind you that can, address each one of those issues. And it's not even just address, but be cognizant of those, because, environmental compliance, especially if you're deemed the environmental compliance manager, you have to just basically be looking out ahead of you and making sure that you're seeing any of these items that might come up. Even if they're not in your wheelhouse, you have to be aware of all those things. So yeah, that's a good point. The one other thing I wanted to bring up about transportation is the public scrutiny. I don't know about you, Lance, but when I see that sign, the this road will be closed, you know, you think about, oh, how am I going to get to work, or how am I going to pick up my kids, or now, you know, if I take the alternative route, you know, is everybody else going to know that same route or anything? So, you know, I mean, when you have roads, you know, road work, especially in other transportation projects, it kind of represents an inconvenience to people. So sometimes when people are inconvenienced, they start looking for things, you know, like the picture on the right where you see a bunch of people standing around. I don't know if you've heard, but we've definitely gotten calls on some projects where people are like, why is everybody standing around? You know, is that my tax dollars at work? And you know, but I mean, that picture on the right was actually a kickoff to a project that we started. And it was in everybody's best interest to understand that we were going through a contaminated area just from a safety and a health and, you know, a health standpoint. And so that's what everybody was standing around, is actually looking at, you know, somebody from my team telling them what they might encounter on this project. So
yeah, the things that are frustrating for us is we'll see barrels and barrels for miles and miles, and then we won't see anybody working. But they'll close, but they'll close down the lane, and you're like, that was pointless. But
I've seen that too. And I'm always like, nice traffic control. What's going on with that? But yeah, sometimes it takes hours just to even set up those barrels. So sometimes they yeah. But I agree. But you know, again, it's that public scrutiny. So that's what's you know, a key item about transportation. Well, moving on. So, you know, when we start off a project with the planning and design phase, you know, I put this graphic because you really need to get your ducks in the row. And the two main environmental compliance items that you need to keep aware of is the environmental review and permitting side, and then the due diligence side. And I don't know if you're ready, Lance, but
I'm ready.
That was my first AC/DC reference right there.
Oh, I think I missed it.
Yeah. So anyway, that's a little known AC/DC song. Are you ready? So there you go.
All right. I need to be on my balls a little better.
I kind of sprung that one on you. I don't know if those following you at home saw that. That's a pretty obscure AC/DC one. I'll get some better ones coming up.
We've already gotten people saying that. Are you ready? They did it first, so that's awesome.
Oh, they did? Okay,
yes.
Awesome. So on the environmental review and permitting side, and this is another topic that we could cover days and days, but really at the inception of a project, there's something called the NEPA process. And what it is the intent is, you know, your project is supposed to protect, maintain, and or enhance the environment. And sometimes that's not always feasible, but you do have to go through a process of showing different alternatives to try to mitigate any impacts to the environment. You know, this is mostly, the big NEPA process is really definitely required on projects that have federal funding. And, you know, federal agencies like the Federal Highway Administration and the Federal Transit Administration have specific guidelines and procedures that you need to follow during the NEPA process. And definitely your NEPA folks need to be, if you have an FHWA and FTA project, they need to understand the ins and outs of their procedures to go through the NEPA process. Some locally funded projects also have similar processes. In Minnesota, we have the MEPA process. I know that sounds really creative, but it's the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act. So there is you know, local funding also has similar requirements. Now the big thing, and this kind of kicks in, you know, especially on like an alternative delivery project where the design is kind of this is where those guardrails come into place. But if you have a significant change in your project, sometimes that can kick it back to the NEPA process again and start all over. And, you know, just for context, the NEPA process on some big projects can take up to 3 years. So that's just you know, it's a big hurdle that projects need to start right up at inception that they need to follow. So that's all in that environmental compliance umbrella. You know, I'm just going to gloss over it, but again, permitting is, you know, you're talking about wetlands permitting, you know, 4F, all kinds of other permits kind of follow along with that environmental review process and just show that, you know, this project is going to be compliant. You're not impacting, you know, significant wetlands or significant, scenic, and, wild rivers, there's a whole bunch of, endangered species. You just, that kind of covers, that's what the NEPA umbrella covers. And then if there are some impacts that are allowable, then that's where that permitting comes into play.
That's a big umbrella.
It is a big umbrella, and I
big
can
umbrella.
tell you that's why.
Yeah.
That's why we could be talking about that for a long time. So the next thing, this is kind of what I deal with a lot is the due diligence side. Now, we talked about, Lance, and you kind of talked about, I think you used the word parcel or plat.
Mm-hmm.
And, transportation projects take up a lot of parcels. And especially if you have a brand new road project, or you're widening a road, or you need a spot to put a stormwater pond, or you need to put a park and ride or a transit facility. Typically, to put that project, to build that project, you need to buy property. And, we kind of put it in this big group of right-of-way, or you need easements or temporary easements. And the thing that is important is, buying property for a transportation project has the same requirements as if you were buying a property for a commercial project. You still need to do what's called your due diligence. And, there's something out there, called the Superfund Law, or CERCLA of 1980, that makes people who are buying property, they have to satisfy the innocent landowner requirements. And really, that's showing that you are looking at a property and identifying contaminant sources or potential for contamination, and that you're aware of that when you're buying, and you're getting the proper release of liability, so you're not associated with that contaminants. And DOTs, and they're not exempt from this requirement. In fact, sometimes public agencies are held to they're more scrutinized. So it is important to do the due diligence as part of the planning phase of construction. And your due diligence can includes a phase 1 environmental site assessment. I'll kind of briefly cover that. A phase 2 environmental site assessment. There's other things that you might want to consider regarding asbestos on bridges, or treated wood and on your guardrails, and all these other things. What you want to do is you want to make sure that you understand all of your contaminants and your contaminant risks, because it's not only important when you're planning and you're designing it, but you want to account for that for construction. I mean, could you imagine if you didn't look for contamination, Lance, and then all of a sudden you start digging a pond and you realize the entire pond was a former landfill? I mean, who's going to pay for that?
Right.
So that's, you want to make sure that, at the beginning as part of the planning stage.
So Jackie, when you're planning a road or starting construction of a road, one of the things, especially here in North Texas, because they're building roads like crazy, the amount of time it takes. So it might take 5 years to complete a road, but so that means, so does a phase 1 in the transportation world last longer than just a year, or even the soil testings? Like, what if you soil tested during the due diligence phase, get in, and then 3 years something happens? Or is that an issue at all, or?
Yeah, it is it is an issue, and that's why you want to do it during the design side of it before you start construction. Because let's say you do your phase 1 and your phase 2 and you find something, you can work with the designers to say, hey, you know what, maybe if we raise the road profile a little bit higher, we'll avoid this contaminated groundwater. Or what about putting a pond here instead of here? So what that can do is if you work as you do this due diligence during the design phase, you can incorporate that in the design, and then mitigate any future schedule issues when you didn't, because obviously if you start digging a pond and you're into construction and nobody knows that they ran into it, that's going to add money and time trying to figure out what to do with that. So yeah, that's why it's crucial that you get, as soon as you get your NEPA process done and your alignment, you start working on this due diligence hand in hand with the design process. I'm not going to say that you find everything, you know, right away during the due diligence, and I'll talk about that too. But I mean, if you make your best attempt, you can put this in your specifications, and contractors can be aware of it and bid appropriately, and schedule can account for it too.
Gotcha.
Oh, here's another one.
All right, I'm gonna try it. I'm gonna make an attempt. This is a trick. Since we let our audience try to answer it, but I'm gonna try. Give them a few more seconds. Okay, I'm gonna say it was who made who, not what made what.
There you go.
Yes.
There you go. Good job.
Nice.
Did you know Who Made Who was part of a 1984 soundtrack to a Stephen King movie? That was Maximum Overdrive. Do you remember that movie?
That was about a diesel engine that went rogue. Is that right? Yeah. That was before it was at its height. A lot of useless information in this webinar, by the way.
I know.
This is awesome.
There you go. I had to look that up, but I remember that song, but I didn't know it was part of a Stephen King movie. So there you go.
That's awesome.
Okay, so we kind of briefly touched about phase 1 ESAs and phase 2s, and I'm not going to go through it, but the phase 1 side is more of the desktop review. There is a site visit reconnaissance part of it, but it's mostly looking at historical aerials, land use areas, trying to figure out if there's a dry cleaner there, it likely might have, you know, there might be some impacts to the soil or groundwater. So it's more of a desktop review. The phase 2 it's more intrusive, and it requires the collection of sampling to actually confirm the presence or absence of contamination. So that's where you see your drill rigs, or we do test pits sometimes, or test trenches with excavation equipment. That's where you grab your samples. The one thing that people get kind of caught up with phase 2s, especially with transportation, is they only look at places where contamination might be. So, okay, well, there was a tank here, so we're gonna go where the tank is. And I mean, that's a good place to look for that material, but you also need to make sure that, say, a stormwater pond is, you know, 15 feet on the other side of the tank, you might want to put your boring or your location there, because you want not only to find the contamination, but you also want to know what you're going to run into during construction. So you really need to focus your sample locations and your depths, not just to where the likely contamination is, but where also you're going to be doing construction. So there's a little bit of art behind that. You need to make sure that you're working with the designers and looking at their plans and profiles and making sure you're targeting the right locations. And then, you know, one thing I wanted to, you know, note to this group and to you too, Lance, we kind of talked about this before this presentation, is that, you know, when we're drilling along roadways, it's dangerous in a lot of cases, or you got to get a lot of permits and traffic control, closed lanes, all kinds of things. And so, you know, it's inconvenient to the public and to a lot of different people if you have to go out and do more sampling for other types of studies like geotechnical or cultural resources. And sometimes you can get a benefit by collecting samples for a multitude of reasons. So another reason why to have your environmental, you know, team or consultant working with the design team closely to see if you can have some you know, savings, or at least try to get as much as you can out of your precious, you know, soil borings. So this is just a real quick example. So I didn't mention this, but on a phase 1 is a little different than a typical phase 1 for a property. And the reason why, again, is back to that scale and linear aspect of a phase 1 or a transportation project, is that you cannot look, you would take years to do a phase 1 if you looked at each property, you know, went through each building, did everything a standard, you know, ASTM. So a lot of times for transportation corridors in transportation projects, you do kind of what's a modified version of the phase 1, where you're looking at the parcels and you're trying to put them into buckets. And what you see in this photo is we looked at each one of these parcels along the blue line, or the Botno Light Rail project, and we tried to put them into 3 buckets, or actually 4 buckets. Is there a high chance for contamination, a medium chance for contamination, a low chance for contamination, or there's just some parcels that we don't need to worry about. We call those de minimis. So what we do is we kind of, try to at least narrow things down. So when, you're looking at a corridor and you see that bright red, that should set off an alarm bell to the designers and the people who are buying properties that, hey, maybe this area we should look at a little bit closer in relation to the construction and property acquisition. So it's a little bit, the phase one process is a little bit different on transportation projects.
That's interesting.
Does that make sense? It's
yeah.
more of it's a high level view.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's different. And when you get a consultant that hasn't seen that type of format before, it takes a little bit of time you gotta kind of understand that a little bit more. It's a different thinking. Here's a quick, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, yeah, it would take forever if you're doing miles and miles of, of highway or roads. It would take forever to do a phase one on each site.
Definitely. Yeah, it would take a while. So you have to be high level, and you accept a little bit of risk under that, but you have to keep the project moving. But here's an example of what we saw in a phase one. This is the St. Croix Bridge. It's a bridge, beautiful bridge that actually crosses the scenic, the St. Croix River here from our Stillwater, Minnesota to Wisconsin neighbors. But this picture, this historic aerial you see it looks kind of like it's a water body, that big kind of black square. Doesn't it kind of look like a water body or a really dense
forest? Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, just off the aerial photo is a huge power plant, and that black spot is a huge coal slag storage area. So that was a ginormous coal slag area.
Wow.
In 1980 when that photo was collected. And coal slag, I won't get into too much, but it's a solid waste, and it can contain higher concentrations of metals and everything. Well, for the St. Croix project, and I'll show you in the next slide, is this location was selected for a stormwater pond. So we actually went out there and tried to evaluate really what the extent of the slag was, because that photo was from 1980 and it didn't look like that now. But what we did is we did a pretty extensive investigation of where the pond was. We quantified the slag piles. We looked at all the pier locations for the bridge. We went through and tried to quantify this all as part of the specification process, so the contractor knew what they were getting into, and we could estimate costs for the project. The interesting thing is we were out there doing some digging, and we found out later on that actually the slag wasn't our biggest issue. There was a dump. Somebody filled in the wetland with a whole bunch of dump. And the bad thing is there was asbestos throughout that entire dump. So that whole project actually turned into a whole separate project where, the owner actually bid out the pond digging in advance of the bridge project because they didn't want to slow the bridge project down. So the pond was actually dug before they even started construction of the bridge, which was interesting enough. But then again, that's the reason why you do some of this stuff ahead of time is that then it can account for the schedule and help streamline some things. But yeah, so that's what a phase two will show you. It'll show you surprises, hopefully, if you're doing it right. I'm just going to quickly go through this. Some people are surprised to hear that there's asbestos, or what we call regulated materials, on bridges. Asbestos is still not technically banned in the US. You can't make it in the US, but doesn't mean you can't import it. And, when you're doing a bridge demolition or a bridge repair job, there can be asbestos, lead paint, other items on a bridge that you need to consider before you're doing a bridge replacement. There's also asbestos in utilities, and when you're doing a road work project, there can be asbestos on the buried utilities. I've seen it on culverts. I mean, even when you think of those like cattle crossings, they waterproof those, and sometimes that waterproofing can contain asbestos. So again, something to consider when you're planning for a project. So here's just a couple examples of what we see on bridges. I just thought I would throw those in so we could have some pictures of some lead plates. We actually core through abutments to try to get to the waterproofing behind the abutments, because you can't you can't access it always. So that picture on the lower right is a coring equipment. So it shows some of the work that we do for the bridges. Okay, so we're going to move into construction, and I better pick it up, I guess. So with construction, we got stormwater erosion control. I think a lot of people are familiar with it. We've kind of briefly touched on contaminated regulated materials. And then there's a natural resource component into construction that I'll go through. And again, this is going to be a lot of pictures, less text, just kind of giving some examples.
I love pictures.
Yeah, good. Before I click on, is anybody else, you see anything there, Lance, in this?
Okay, I've been looking, and our audience has not seen it, so this one was camouflaged very well for those about to build. So
I don't know if you're familiar with the sound. For those about to rock,
salute
you. 1981 AC/DC.
Oh,
so,
you are a real fan, man. Hardcore.
I wish I could say that. Wikipedia helped me out on putting this together. I wish I could, but yeah. So I wanted to put "We salute you" because I really think that construction, you know, planning and the design phases are really exciting, but I think construction is really where it's at sometimes. So so we salute you, the people who do construction, I think. Here's real quick there. Yeah, there you go. Listen, one is so hidden. So stormwater erosion control, it's all under the umbrella of the NPDES permits. You know, there's requirements. If you're doing any land disturbance of 1 or more acres, you need to be in compliance with this permit. You need to get the permit, be in compliance. You need to prevent erosion of exposed soil surfaces. I showed that big rill by the porta potty. You know, that's a big no-no under NPDES. You need to control sediment leaving the project. And, you know, part of this is all, you know, some people call it SWP3. I think that's what it says in Texas. We call it SWIP, but it's that stormwater prevention and stormwater pollution prevention plan, excuse me, that you develop, you know, as part of the project and you need to adhere to. So that's all part of this NPDES compliance. There you go.
I got
you saw this one. Though.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
I gave it away.
Done dirt cheap.
Done dirt cheap.
It's not very cheap on projects sometimes. But one of the keynotes about transportation, and especially with stormwater erosion control, is you can have miles and miles and miles of exposed soil. I think about, you know, the picture on the right, that's 11 miles of an added lane. And really the contractor and the environmental compliance team have to keep this in mind when they stage their project and they start working on projects is, you know, you only have a certain number of days to stabilize these soils, and you want to make sure that, you know, if you're opening up a big swath of land, that you're ready to, you know, stabilize it and mitigate any erosion. So, you know, there is a whole art to installing BMPs. There's sometimes you can put what's called soil berms instead of your typical silt fence, but really that's where, you know, you really need that, you know, stormwater expert, erosion control expert, you know, on your team just to make sure that, you know, you're not putting in, you know, miles of silt fence that you're going to run over the next day, or that, you know, so that can result into a big cost to the project. Or if you're not following it, there's even a bigger cost to the project if you get fined for allowing a sediment release. So, I mean, that's what I'm going to say about that. But, you know, it can take a whole day just to inspect this, and you have to have, you know, weekly or rain event inspections when you have that much ground opened up. Contaminated regulated materials. This is a couple pictures here of some things that we've seen. This is when you see that stuff, you know, Lance, how we talked about trying to find everything during a phase 2. This is what happens when you don't find it, you know. So the picture on the left is, it doesn't look like much to people other than a concrete pile. But actually, if you look at those little straw looking things or tubes that are in the concrete, that's asbestos. And there was about 8 piles of this on the Central Corridor. It's a light rail project. This is on University Avenue, right through the heart of St. Paul. And this pile was about minutes away of getting loaded up onto a truck and going to a recycling where it would have been crushed and incorporated with a lot of other concrete. So basically it would have contaminated and allowed basically concrete to go anywhere that had asbestos in it. So this was one of those things that you want to be aware of, early in the project, because this quickly put a stop to this project. And with this project, there was people who didn't have access to their businesses. We had to staple big asbestos signs out there and demarcate it. So it was a real inconvenience to a lot of people, and just something to be aware of on these types of projects. And then the photo on the right, I wish we had smell-o-vision, but that was some really, really nasty contaminated material from a petroleum site. That again, you start opening that up and you can't just put that stuff back down, or you can't just take it anywhere. You have to handle it appropriately.
Jackie, we have a question. Tips for managing a temporary runoff storage on a constantly shifting growing project.
I think I mentioned this in the blog. Repeat that question again.
It just says tips for managing temporary runoff storage on a constantly shifting growing project.
Yeah, we kind of talked about that. So when you're having a project that's shifting and you got stormwater and you're creating all these little potholes of water all over the place, you need to dewater, or you need to put that stormwater somewhere. And really the tips I would say is plan your work ahead of time and make sure you have a sediment basin nearby that you can use for stormwater storage. Or you might have to have some sort of engineered means where you have a tank that's going to follow along with the work somehow, or a series of tanks that you can use for storage and treatment of the stormwater, so you can get the sediment out and treat it. But that's a really good question, and I think it really you need to have a person looking at the situation and making sure that you're staging your work well ahead of time.
And then a question for an asbestos, and this is my question, so if you want to skip over it, we can. But I know we know asbestos is extremely dangerous when it's airborne, and that's why it's so you don't want to mess with it to get it airborne. If it is in the soil, does a phase 2 detect asbestos, and is it considered a contaminant in the soil?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. So it is considered a contaminant. It's more of a debris. It's a solid waste. So if you're doing a phase 2 and you start seeing debris, that might be indicative of a material that might contain asbestos. So most common scenario you see is somebody demolished a building in place and they put it into the former basement and covered it up, and you start digging and you start seeing building debris. You need to make sure that if you're starting to see what's called suspect asbestos containing materials, that you're sampling it for asbestos, because that material can't just go to any old landfill or be treated in any way. And generally, when you're seeing debris with asbestos, it's been crushed or rendered what we call friable, where it can become airborne. So it is a concern. You don't just take soil samples for asbestos, though, Lance. That's a little tricky, because you can't really see asbestos fibers by themselves to the naked eye. So if you start just sampling soil willy-nilly, there's no really good way to remediate it. And so what you really try to do is stick with the materials that contain asbestos, and identify them that way and remediate them that way. That work? Did I answer your question? Or?
Yeah, I was just curious. Yeah.
Yep. Oh, there's another ACDC reference, borrowed time. There you go. Okay, I'll catch up here. The last but not least, we got the natural resources component. And a lot of people, this is actually kind of an interesting aspect, because this is kind of an ever-moving target. The picture up on the left-hand side is showing stormwater, but it's also showing wetlands. And, we got to be aware of impacts to wetlands during construction work. You can't just have, people driving around, driving across it, et cetera, et cetera. So we try to make sure that in plan sheets as well as during construction work that you have identified and even demarcate out in the field sensitive environmental areas like wetlands. A coworker or colleague of mine, Jill Michelson, sent me that picture in the middle. It's a robin's nest that was actually built on a crane. And there are certain regulations out there that if you have birds that are nesting during construction and there's eggs in the nest and it's an active nest, you have to leave it alone. And so there's been all kinds of creative things to do on bridge jobs to try to keep birds from nesting, because once they start leaving eggs in places, that can create a damper to some of your construction work. Some other things to consider is that's the northern long-eared bat. When you are doing a road construction project here in Minnesota and probably in other areas, is you can't clear trees. You have to clear trees in a certain window because there might be some northern long-eared bats that are nesting in those trees. So, again, it's the birds and the bees and all other kinds of things that you need to consider from a natural resources standpoint with transportation. The picture on the lower left-hand side is zebra mussels, and I don't know, if that's a concern in Texas. Is that do you hear about zebra mussels yet for people's boats and everything? And those zebra mussels were on some sheet piling that was used for a bridge project, and unfortunately, that sheet piling was pulled off the project and was taken to another project. And so, that all needs to be decontaminated just like your fishing boat does. And when you have, thousands of square feet or linear feet of sheet pile or barges or any other equipment that's working on a barge or in a river, you need to make sure that's, taken care of and removed. And then, I also got this picture from Jill, but this is a causeway that they're constructing to start working on a project, and you need to make sure that even though you're doing work in these waters, you need to try to make sure you're lessening your impacts to the waterways. I mean, fish don't want to swim in that brown milky water, and nobody wants to catch fish from that type of area, right? So that's another example of what you need to be aware of from a natural resources standpoint. The funny thing about the birds nesting is I actually worked on a project where they found some buried asbestos and they pulled the asbestos out. The work stopped until people could figure out it was culverts that were lined with asbestos, and they pulled these culverts out and put them on the side of the road until they could figure out which they realized it was wrong and they stopped work. But until they could get an asbestos abatement contractor out there, what happened is some birds came and nested in the asbestos. So so then you had to wait until the birds, the eggs hatched or whatever before you could take care of the asbestos, and you had to make sure that I was being inspected and maintained. So yeah, you can have those unique situations on those types of projects. So as I promised, I just thought I'd have a quick summary of avoiding these environmental compliance potholes on these transportation projects. And, as I mentioned, you'd be aware of the funding sources, federal funds versus local funds, and the contract delivery method, who's bearing the risk and who's ultimately responsible for environmental compliance. And because, money talks. Lance.
Money talks,
so,
yes.
Money talks. Environmental compliance runs through the entire life of the project. So make sure that when you're starting a transportation project, you have planners, but you have a team that's involved with the project from start to finish, because we talked about how they can be involved with the design and mitigate, risks in the design side, but also you have somebody knowledgeable on the constructability side too, of handling, environmental issues. And then, I didn't really touch on this as kind of a gray area, but I talked about Superfund and CERCLA and MPDS. Environmental laws are really, a lot of these laws are on the onus of the owner, or sometimes a responsible party that's defined by law. And as creative or as much as you can think of that, you can write a contract and put the risk on somebody else. And there certainly can happen on contracts too. sometimes the law supersedes what's in your contract. So then again, that's where you want to make sure that your environmental compliance team and person understands the law versus the contract and who's ultimately responsible, because if there's a violation that happens, sometimes the contract's not going to save people. So it's important to really know what you're going to encounter before you encounter it, or know what you do when the surprises show up. So,
Jackie, do you have an example of that by chance? Like anything that has come across where, a contract is written and the law says something different?
Yeah. So, well,
briefly if you can, but if you can't, we can.
I don't want to get into too much, but let's just say, the contractor used a material that was acceptable under the specifications of the contract. So they used a recycled concrete that was acceptable as a use for aggregate on a material, but the concrete created some impacts to the water. I don't actually, that's maybe not a good example, but I guess what I'm trying to say is in a project, the NPDES permit on a lot of projects are both maintained, they're co-permittees, so the owner and the contractor, so they're both duly responsible for complying with the NPDES permit. Now, the owner can write in the contract, contractor is responsible for following the NPDES permit, and the contractor will adhere to that. But if there is a release to the stormwater, from what the contractor happens, the regulatory agency might go back to the owner and say, you weren't overseeing this work well enough, and it's also your responsibility.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I don't know if I could briefly get into a specific example without putting the things behind.
Yeah, I think I got the
yeah. So
I just,
sometimes people, can say, well, it's written in the contract. It's black and white in the contract. And it is typically, but ultimately.
Yeah. Wouldn't the owner be, if it's a roadway, a government agency anyway, or?
Yeah, it can be. It mostly is a government. Well, when you say government, like a DOT or a county or a city. Yep. So they're a government entity, but the regulatory authority is typically another government entity.
Yeah.
So for example, you have your TCEQ or your MPCA, and sometimes, even though they're co-government agencies or sister agencies, if you will, that doesn't mean that, the DOTs can do anything different. Sometimes it feels like they're even under more scrutiny sometimes, because they're the ones leading the way. So yeah, good question. Oh, let's just talk here. Okay, so we got the money talks. We kind of
did get that one.
Yeah. So that's what I have for my presentation. But feel free if you have any other questions, audience, or Lance, you know where to find me. But here's my contact information. So do we have anything on the chat?
Nothing on the chat, and we're just really happy that we had no technical difficulties through your sleet storm in Minnesota.
I know.
And so, but no, that was oh, we do. We have one question came in at the very. Okay, so Jackie, coal slag and asbestos dump for your bridge project, was that from the adjacent power plant, and did they pay for the cleanup? That might be get too specific, but.
Good question. So the coal slag was from the adjacent power plant. I don't know if I can comment where they cleaned up on it. This is just a generality, and I'm going to say it is most government entities don't go after private parties for cleanup in a lot of situations, unless it's a really dire situation and they need to. They feel like they need to go back to the private entity. Most government agencies don't do that. In a lot of cases, they just plan for those contingencies in their budget, or they avoid them altogether. But the dump material in that situation, nobody knows where that came from. Sometimes it happens when you're having, a riverfront or an area where nobody's watching it, an abandoned area. People see a low spot and they, drive up a couple of trucks and dump it in the night, so that's why in a lot of our phase ones, we look for, like in that aerial photo, clearings or roads or anything that might indicate that somebody's doing some illicit dumping?
Benjamin says, I am thunderstruck. Great job, Jackie. I appreciate your presentation. So, hey, Benjamin's going to get a little special treat soon. But so,
Thank you, Benjamin.
Yeah, that was awesome. Great presentation. Great information and engaging. So, so Jackie on her slides had Steve Carell as in one of her pictures, and if you could name that movie that she did, I'll send you a special gift as well. So there you go. So if you saw it, it'll be very easy to pick up. So Jackie, thank you so much for the webinar, and it was awesome. And I can't wait to get you on here again. Is this your first one?
This is.
You did fantastic. I'm impressed.
Thank you.
Awesome.
I think I told you everything I know. I don't know if I need to do another one. No, I just kidding. But yes, well, I would be happy to be back, Lance.
I think this one went so well. You're gonna somebody already got it. So the movie was Anchorman. Robert, you got it. So loud noises. So all right. Well, we'll see. The next month's webinar is actually RMP PSM for identifying the likelihood of hazardous events in your facility, and I believe Nick Foreman and Conan Reed will be in that presentation. So, Jackie, can't wait to get you back, and everybody have a great evening.
Thank you, Lance.
All right, bye-bye.
Take care.